Okay, as I've said before, I don't plan on doing too many review-based videos on this channel unless they prove to be popular, but I felt I just had to give my opinion on this particular movie. And please do note that I only saw this last night, so these are only my initial thoughts, and my opinion could always change over time, though in this case I seriously doubt it. And obviously, there will be spoilers ahead. So if you haven't seen the movie yet and you don't want anything ruined, I would suggest you turn off the video now and come back later. This is your only spoiler warning. And once again, I'll be going light on the pictures here because I want to be able to focus more on the actual review in this video. Okay, so let's get into it. Alright, I must admit that I didn't go into this movie with very high hopes. To me, it looked like it was going to be one of those typical teenage humor type movies. But I still wanted to give it a fair chance, so I tried to go in with as much of an open mind as possible. And that being said, anybody who says this is a kid's movie did not watch it, plain and simple. I know I've already gone over many times how I feel Pixar has become too mature for children, but this might just take the cake. Seriously, I'd almost argue this deserved a PG-13 rating because it gets into some rather awkward and uncomfortable stuff that should not be shown to children. Now, to be fair, I don't know how much this was targeted to kids, but among other things, drug use is actually mentioned, as well as some aspects of puberty. Honestly, if you are a parent watching this video, then I'd recommend you skip over this movie as far as your child goes, because it just barely skirts the line of being appropriate for them. Now, you're free to disagree with me on that, but that is my personal opinion. And then there's the humor. What is it with modern comedies trying to make people as uncomfortable as possible? Okay, obviously I'm not a big fan of cringe comedy, but this was absolutely ridiculous. That scene towards the beginning with the notebook and her mother driving to the convenience store was so over the top and ridiculous. I was convinced it was going to turn out to be a bait and switch, like that scene in Luca where he imagines himself saying he went to the surface when in actuality he says nothing. But no, it was real. And that's supposed to be funny? And then there's that scene from one of the trailers where the mother follows her to school, and not only is it just as cringeworthy in the movie, but the punchline makes it way worse. I mean, do people really think stuff like that is funny? Because while jokes at other people's expense can be funny, this just felt like pure sadism and took it way too far at that. And to think, some people will probably still insist this is a kid's movie. But to be fair, there was some genuinely funny stuff, specifically the box full of kittens test. That was a good moment, as well as the reveal at the end that the shaman had to put all of their red panda spirits into Four Town merchandise. I think that was the closest I got to actually laughing out loud. Alright, but to try to discuss this a bit more rationally, I felt this movie's plot, specifically when it came to the relationship with May and her mother, was very similar to Encanto. And if you ask me, I believe that movie did it better. Now, I know I said in my review of that movie that there were certain aspects of it that could have been slightly improved, but I still think it handled its themes pretty well, and at the very least, never played Alma's abusive behavior for a joke. Her toxic behavior is played absolutely straight every time it comes up. And even though her blowing up at Mirabelle right before the house falls apart can come as a bit of a surprise to some, I still feel there was plenty of hints as to the damage she was actually doing sprinkled throughout the movie beforehand, so it still has plenty of foreshadowing. Here, I just didn't feel that. I mean, her mother goes from feeling like a typical, if slightly overbearing mother who just wants to see her child succeed to a hilariously over the top domineering and abusive parent, and then right back again. Even her own reaction to hearing her mother called is played as a joke, and then at the end, that very same strained relationship is played completely seriously. To put it simply, I just felt that the conflict between child and parent wasn't properly set up, making it feel somewhat odd when that suddenly becomes the central focus of the climax. And speaking of which, a Pixar movie with no villain that leads to a climax where the heroes have to stop a force created or exacerbated by one of their own inner problems sounds awfully familiar. But to get back to it, I just felt like there was more substance in her problems with the panda itself or her and her friends really wanting to go to the Four Town concert than there was as far as her and her mother went. Now, you can say I'm wrong all you want. As I've said, I don't claim to be an expert on storytelling, but that's just how I personally feel. Now, I also felt this movie tried too hard to appeal to teenagers, from those extremely 2000 songs by Four Town to the way those aunts of hers dressed, to even the style of humor I mentioned earlier. However, I could be wrong about that. As I just said, I'm no expert on these things. But all I do know is that it wasn't the type of stuff that really appeals to me. And to be fair, maybe that's the thing. Maybe this movie was only targeting a very specific group of people, and I'm just not one of them. And there's nothing wrong with that. But I would also like to believe that most of my criticisms thus far have still been as fair and objective as possible. And you're free to call me out on it if you think that's not the case. And with that being said, there were some things about this movie that I did enjoy, or at the very least appreciated. Mealing feels like a real teenager, and if you can just accept this isn't a kid's movie, I actually liked that it didn't shy away from her growing interest in boys. In fact, I almost wish they had dedicated more time to that. Her friends were also an excellent standout, supporting her, standing by her, and loving her no matter what. Admit it, we all wish we could have friends like that. And as I said earlier, the chemistry and friendship between them is done so well as their teenage obsession with the boy band, that it does start to genuinely take away from the conflict between Mealing and her mother. Because frankly, I found that whole thing a lot more interesting and wish they would have focused on that as the central storyline, as I feel that would have made the movie better than just retreading Encanto. If anything, a better idea might have been to use her love for her friends, as well as her increasing bond and desire to be with them, to draw out the main conflict between parent and child. Now, I know that's briefly touched on in the movie, but not nearly to the extent that I think they should have used that. And as far as the red panda itself goes, I knew she was going to end up keeping it. Come on, this is a Pixar movie. Did you ever think for 1 second that she was actually going to get rid of it? I mean, I know I would have, but this is Pixar we're talking about. And that's another thing. All of the characters talk about how the red panda inspired this huge change in Mealing, but I didn't really feel that too much. I mean, there is an obvious difference. I just don't think it's to the same extent that the characters say it is. If anything, I just felt she was acting a little more rebellious, but that's something every teenager goes through, and something she already had before the panda even showed up. So I don't know how much credit I'd really give the red panda in that regard. Now, I will freely admit that I could be wrong about that and might be missing the obvious signs, but watching it, that's how I genuinely felt. But again, that's something I could most definitely be mistaken about. Though one thing I really did like about the red panda were the kids' over the top, oh my gosh, it's so cute reactions to it. I would even say that's really the only time the movie's over the top humor really worked, though even then they started to overdo it a bit. And even though the climax as a whole didn't impress me as much as previous Pixar movies, I did think that her mother turning into the red panda did show an interesting contrast of how dangerous it can actually be if you can't control it really well. But other than that, I mostly felt the climax went on too long, was too over the top in execution, and a bit too heavy handed with concepts that had been treated as little more than jokes beforehand. To put it simply, I definitely wouldn't call this one of Pixar's best movies. Now, again, maybe I'm just not a part of the intended audience, but even then, I still feel there are various story problems that I've just gone over with it. And as I said before, I do think this idea could have worked, but in the end, it's just too cringeworthy, over the top, and waits too long to start injecting genuine emotion into it. And like I just said, there was a good story there, but in execution, the whole thing is just way too awkward for me, and I'm sure many others as well. And while maybe not necessarily too mature, I still say this isn't a movie for children either. In the end, it's still definitely a Pixar movie and has its good points, but I feel that in this case they were putting the emphasis on all the wrong things. Alright, that's pretty much everything I wanted to cover. But now it's your turn to tell me. Did you love Turning Red and think it's Pixar's latest masterpiece? Or did you hate it and think it's a major step down for them? Please feel free to let me know in the comments. But let's try to keep it a civil discussion. We only want to have a conversation here, not a riot. And remember, you can disagree with everything I said if you want to. In this case, I even expect it. This is a movie I could see producing some very different and varied opinions. And lastly, thank you all for watching. It is all greatly appreciated, and I hope to see you all next time.